India's aviation regulator, the DGCA, has mandated checks on the fuel control switches of all Boeing aircraft operating in India. In this, the aviation regulator has only followed in the footsteps of airlines across the world, including Etihad, South Korea, and Singapore Airlines, that also began doing their own quiet checks on the fuel control switches. This after the Air India 17 crash and a preliminary investigation report that revealed a 2018 FAA advisory talking about a possible problem with the locking mechanisms of these fuel switches. Since then, we have also reported on a United Kingdom regulator's directive that was renewed after 2015 on the 15th of May 2025, under 4 weeks before the crash of Air India 171. This pertained to fuel valves and flagged them as a potential safety issue. I'm Barkha Dutt. You're with the Mojo Story. We'll be cutting across live to the United States of America in a moment from now to speak to a top U.S. aviation expert, a top U.S. aviation attorney, Mary Schiavo. She is somebody who has called out a possible software glitch in Boeing that she says is not just well known, but has been well documented in the past, that there are enough examples and precedents from history that also point to a dual rollback of the engines of the 787, which is a highly electric aircraft. This, even as sections of the Western media have smeared the pilots, Captain Sumit and Captain Clive, without evidence, with whispers about a suicide mission that has been rubbished by the pilot community in India. A global pilots forum today has warned against extrapolation and hasty conclusions based on a preliminary investigation report that raises many questions but does not answer them. After the 2018 FAA advisory and now the renewed UK directive that was issued in 2025 on fuel valves, both fuel switches and fuel valves are back in scrutiny. As I mentioned, Air India, even before the DGCA, began its own quiet checks to check whether fuel control switches are working as they should. Let me introduce our newsmaker today. Mary Schiavo is joining us from the United States of America. She's one of the country's foremost aviation attorneys, and previously she's also been the Inspector General with the U.S. Department of Transportation. Thank you, ma'am, for your time. I want to start by asking you whether you have any preliminary perceptions about what has happened in this horrific crash. Boeing itself has quite a notorious and spotty reputation. We've had the Boeing CEO testify before Congress and Senate conceding to security lapses. We've had the incidents of the 737 MAX, where after the first crash, the pilots were blamed, and it took a horrible second crash for Boeing to concede a design flaw. You have been flagging a possible software glitch in a highly computerized electric aircraft such as the 787. I want to know your thoughts. Over to you, Mary.
Sure. Well, I've worked, literally hundreds of aviation crash cases. And what I always do is I look at prior crashes. I look at things that have happened before, things where we know there are known problems. And you flagged a couple of them right away. The Boeing 737 MAX 8 crashes, where a system called the MCAS caused the aircraft itself, without pilot input, to put the plane into a nosedive. Now, that was a 737. On 787s, there have already been two interesting, somewhat similar situations. On an All Nippon Airways flight back in 2019, as the plane was coming into land, the fuel control cutoff occurred. The plane itself cut off the fuel to the engines. The plane came in like a very heavy glider, but because it was landing, not taking off, there was not a crash. They were able to get to the runway. On takeoff, you don't have that luxury. You need your engines, producing full thrust, and you only have a couple seconds in the critical time from the time you rotate and lift that plane off the runway until you're at a good rate of climb. So, and then there was a United Airlines flight between Washington, D.C. and Nigeria, and it was a 787 Dreamliner just this year, and the plane itself put the plane into a nosedive. And there was a thrust issue, there was an engine issue, and the plane experienced some deviation. So there is a lot of precedent for being suspect about the computer control systems on the Dreamliner and any fly-by-wire modern aircraft, because it's a flying computer. There are millions of lines of code, and until that is examined, it is impossible to blame the pilots.
So, elaborate on that. When you say that it is impossible at this moment to blame the pilots because it is such a highly computerized system and it is known to have had glitches in the past, can we actually start with the Japan incident that you mentioned with All Nippon, where basically the 787 both engines quit on landing? Talk a little bit about this. Take us through this incident and what it says to you.
Well, what that says to me on the Nippon Airways, and fortunately, no one was hurt or no one was killed, but the plane has many systems, and this particular system was mandated by the United States Federal Aviation Administration, and it wanted the plane to have the ability, all by itself, pilots didn't have to do this, to sense whether it's in the air or on the ground. And the reason for that is if the plane was on the ground, they wanted the aircraft to be able to cut the thrust control, literally do cutoff. So the plane on the ground didn't have, runaway engines, run into other planes, run off the end of the runway, etc. So the plane itself will sense when it's in the air and when it's on the ground. And what happened in the ANA flight back in 2019 is the plane thought it was already on the ground and it was still in the air. And, for a pilot, you look out the window if unless you're in severe instrument flying conditions in the weather, but when you're in the air and when you're on the ground. But the aircraft was supposed to assist in that, and they have this system where it will cut the engines if the plane itself thinks it's on the ground. Very important thing to examine. It's happened before, and until that is also examined along with a myriad other things, that's an issue for me.
And the second point that the comment that you made that will be heard with a lot of interest and respect here in India is that you say at this juncture there is simply no basis to blame the pilots until we have said enough and investigated enough about into the software issues, the computerized issues, the software glitches in the past, and so on. What has been happening here in India is rather unfortunate, and not just in India. We've had sections of the Western media do run a kind of whisper campaign about whether one of the pilots deliberately basically cut off the fuel to the engines. And the pilot community here is up in arms. Those who fly the plane have been talking about it being a highly electric aircraft. They've been talking about the possibility for dual engine failure. They've been saying even if the fuel switches were moved, the Boeing manual actually says if both engines flame out, you need to turn the switches off and on, to use layperson language, to reset the engines. When you say at this juncture it's impossible to blame the pilots, what would you be looking to check first?
Well, first of all, the information we have is just tiny little snippets. For example, in the United States, the government is not allowed to put out the actual audio recordings of the pilot's voices, but a full transcript of that cockpit voice recording is always released. And it's a transcript, and of course it's subject to debate, but that is always a tremendously important part of the investigation. I mean, there are experts whose job it is literally to listen for tiny inflections in the pilot's voice, to listen for every click in the cockpit, to listen for everything that happens. And of course, in subsequent litigations, that actual recording, the voices are allowed to be played in a sealed courtroom, but those sounds on that cockpit are so important. So just having one pilot allegedly say to the other, why did you do cutoff, and the other one say, I didn't, that's not nearly enough examination to say that the pilots did it. For example, do we know, as in All Nippon Airways, do we know if the airplane itself can cut those switches if the aircraft thinks it's on the ground, or there are other issues with the aircraft? That has to be ruled out before anyone could begin to blame the pilots. And I have worked many cases in the past where this exact same thing has happened. Something has gone wrong. It's a mystery. There's a disaster. The pilots aren't alive to defend themselves, and they blame the pilots. And in about 75% of the cases, the pilots are blamed. And in many cases, I, and of course the team I work with, have been able to disprove that. I mean, there are just many cases where the pilots are blamed, and including, just remember, they're not blaming them for suicide, they're blaming them for murder. I mean, This is a heinous accusation, and there is just no evidence of that at this point. Everyone remembers MH370, the plane that disappeared, and immediately the world was blaming the pilots. I worked on that case for almost 10 years. There was not a shred of evidence that the
Yeah.
pilots did that intentionally, and yet they got blamed, and their families were just horrified. So it's way too early to say that, and there are way too many suspicious things to say, oh, it's the pilots, because there's no evidence of that.
I couldn't agree more with you. This propensity to be salacious, maybe to sort of rather believe that it's the pilot to blame than the machine. And I want to talk a little bit about how this has happened in the past. You mentioned the 737 MAX. When the first crash took place, there was even the inquiry blamed the pilot. The pilot happened, by the way, to be an Indian at the time. And when the second crash happened, it's only then that it emerged that the MCAS software, and the pilots had no idea of it, was actually creating interference. When you look at Boeing's own record, the fact that Boeing just recently reached a settlement with the administration of the United States of America, basically by paying penalties, how do we at this stage then say, oh, all the aircraft are safe, given the issues you flagged?
Well, you can, and that's why these investigations, done properly, can take literally years. I mean, you can't just automatically say, oh, it's safe, because there's just so much to examine. And remember, the flight data recorder will have literally millions of lines of code and reported information. It's the most advanced flight data recorder out there, and that will have a lot of things, each one of which have to be examined. And remember, they're going to have to go back through the maintenance records and any irregularity reports for Dreamliners, since they've been flying. And this plane, I think, was a 2014 approximately plane. I mean, there's 10 years of experience. And the thing that happened on the 737 MAX 8 case, on the first one, it had a glitch before. The second one, as far as we know, hadn't experienced glitches, but the similar problems that the pilots faced, that's going to be instructive. And so there's an awful lot of data to go through. And by the way, even after all of this occurred on those two 737 MAX 8 cases, they still said, well, the pilots should have been able to troubleshoot it, know what happened, pull the circuit breakers, and save the plane. Not in 3 seconds or a few seconds, you can't. Remember, there's a million lines of code. It took years to develop this plane, and a pilot facing a life or death situation is to be able to, figure out what happened with the lines of code, find the right breakers, and in case of a takeoff, landing's different. But in the case of the takeoff, they simply do not have the time and the altitude. And of course, altitude is time. The higher you are, you have time to react. I mean, I've worked cases in the past where engines failed. They blamed the pilots. Of course, they were dead and couldn't defend themselves. Turned out the engines had experienced something called core lock. The engines froze up. So there are so many things it could be, and good investigators will go through every possibility, and it's going to take time.
You have spoken about a software glitch specifically involving what's called the TCMA, the Thrust Control Malfunction Accommodation. Can you explain this, and can you explain it in a way that people who are not experts like yourself would understand what concerns you?
Yeah, I'll try. So the TCMA it's on the 787 Dreamliners, is a system that the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration mandated so that the plane itself can assess when it needs to cut back the power. And that is tied in with the flight controllers. And that system will tell the flight controllers, which are on both of the engines, when literally to cut the power if the plane itself thinks it's time to cut the power. And these were the systems that were suspect, that were shown to be malfunctioning in the Al Nippon Airways flight. So literally, this system, which has already been faulted in a prior incident, can and will cut the flow, cut the thrust to the engines, both. If this system malfunctions and says it's time to cut the thrust to the engines, and that has happened before, and that's going to be and should be a subject of great interest, because we know that system can do it.
Do you have a primer? Yeah, thank you for that. I think I understood a lot more than at the beginning of this conversation. I want to ask you, do you have given the tiny little snippets that have come out in the preliminary report, and there's a lot it leaves ambiguous, a lot that we don't know. For example, this image on the screen is an image of the rat being deployed, but we don't actually have a timestamp for when this happened. We know that the fuel switches go from run to cut off 3 seconds into the flight and then come back 10 seconds after that, but we don't know what happens before those 3 seconds. So there's a lot we still don't know. Right. Given these, and we have, as you mentioned, just one sentence from the cockpit voice recorder, which is not even exactly transcribed, it's paraphrased. Now, my question to you is, given these tiny snippets, do you have a prima facie impression of what might have caused the crash, given your work in the past, given the precedents we've seen, as you said, between with the Nippon case or the United flight between Washington and Nigeria? Do you have any first impressions?
Sure. I mean, my first impression, again, it's based on my prior work. I mean, so many cases I've worked on where the knee-jerk reaction was to blame the pilots. And years later, it was proven the pilots didn't do this. It was the aircraft. And there were problems with the aircraft. So my initial impression of the preliminary report, and of course, they had to get this out. The international guidelines are you put a preliminary report out at 30 days. And there's warnings on it that says this is just a preliminary report. This doesn't prove anything. So my initial reaction is still the plane suspect until shown otherwise, because with a plane this advanced, the plane this highly computerized, until we do all these examinations and look at all the evidence, it is not only unfair, but it's simplistic and harmful to blame the pilots, because that cuts off reasonable investigation into other areas unless you say, no, we're not going to just blame the pilots, because many times I have seen this and many times we've been able to disprove that.
If you say the plane is suspect unless shown otherwise, would you at this point, and this has happened before, the 737s were grounded, Boeing had to go back to the drawing board. They had to fix the issue. I think, if I'm not wrong, you have said elsewhere that even after the All Nippon case, Boeing was alerted and they did have to acknowledge design issues. At this point, would you be looking at saying the plane remains the key suspect, the plane is suspect, and therefore, would you be saying ground it till further notice? There are 1,200 of them worldwide.
Well, I probably would, but then I'm very cautious. I probably would put out a what's called a service bulletin or a warning to have everyone inspect the system and inspect it now. Now, you can do that. It depends how it's ordered. Sometimes it's an emergency order and you must do it immediately before any more flights. And sometimes they give them 30 days, 10 days, 6 months to do it. But I think those systems have to be checked worldwide. Sure.
Yeah. So let me ask you this in the end, because we have only a couple more minutes with you, Mary. You have, as an aviation attorney, often defended families in their litigations, in their petitions, in their cases, including after 9/11. Here you have, of course, the Tata Group that owns Air India announcing its own compensation, but Boeing making no such announcement. Do you believe that there are rights that the families have vis-a-vis Boeing?
Oh, sure. The families have rights against Boeing. They'll have rights against the engine manufacturers, General Electric, if they're shown to be at fault. Software manufacturers and developers, they have a lot of rights. The issue is ordinarily people just look to the airline because of a treaty. There is a treaty that makes the airline initially, and if no other cause is found, ultimately responsible, but many others can be held accountable, and they are. They are routinely held accountable in courts around the world. For example, in MH370, the plane that disappeared, they were held accountable in Malaysia, both the government and the airline, and accountability is there. But I will say, on an aviation litigation, it can take from 3 to 5 years. It's not a fast process because there's so much, if done right, there's so much evidence. And there will be here too, there will be a lot of evidence. And if it's Boeing's fault, they will be held accountable, as they were in the 737 MAX 8 cases, but that took a long time.
In the end, given that the Boeing CEO has been on record before US Congress conceding to security lapses and promising to be better, what would concern you the most, given everything you know, given everything you've seen about the 787?
Well, what concerns me the most are the whistleblower reports, and that's a whole nother topic and a lot of information. But there have been several whistleblowers at the Dreamliner 787 plants that said that all the safety measures, the requirements, the manufacturing safeguards were not followed. So all that has to be re-examined again. In fact, we had one tragic case where a whistleblower reported there were metal shavings, for example, on wiring. There were other problems. Those all have to go back and re-examine, and every plane that was subject to those suspect conditions should be re-examined at this point, because this is a turning point for the 787. This is the first fatal crash of that aircraft, and it's time for a good in-depth dive and going back to all those whistleblower reports, because some people were bravely trying to call attention to problems, and I don't think they were successfully all examined, looked at, and remediated.
Mary Schiavo, thank you. It's been a pleasure. I think what I take away from you is do not blame the pilots right now. There's simply no evidence to do it. In most cases, it's convenient to blame pilots who are no longer alive to defend themselves. There are documented issues with this highly computerized aircraft, the 787. The Nippon Airways is one such case where the engines failed on landing. Here, you are concerned once again, in particular, about a software glitch, and there is Boeing's own spotty record and the fate of the whistleblowers. I think you've put it all into brilliant perspective. We value your time and your insights, and we hope to talk to you again very soon. Take care, and thank you.
Thank you.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.